So that's the team there again. Our bread and butter is managing the dive fisheries. So we're in the commercial shellfish realm, and these are the fisheries that you have to go and get by hand. There are other people that are doing the crab and shrimp that you get with the pod, or the beaches, the clams and oysters that you're picking on the beach. But my team of 8 is just the dive fisheries. And the biggest one by far is the geoduck. We're going to talk plenty about that today. But just mentioning that we've also got some cool fisheries for a couple of species of sea urchin, green and red there. See a sea cucumber, scallops. And then we also have, probably our favorite thing to do is a former dive fishery, the pinto abalone. And if you were at a Cocktails and Fishtales last year or a few months ago, you may have seen Emily Luce, who's in this picture, telling you about the pinto abalone. And that's a former dive fishery. Now this is endangered because we took too many of them in the dive fishery. And now we have a hatchery and we're going to bring them back from endangered status. The rest of them, we're hoping to do a good job making it so they don't go the way of the abalone, and we have sustainable fisheries on them for forever. But the geoduck, the world's largest burrowing clam. There are larger clams, yes. You've seen them in cartoons. They swallow the divers. Those are in the South Pacific. Those are surface-sitting clams. They're really cool, but we're not going to talk about them. But if it's a burrowing clam you want, the geoduck's your largest. The average weight is 2.2 pounds, or about a kilo. Siphon necks can get up to about 3 feet long. So when I'm digging them, sometimes I have to give up because the geoduck, I cannot reach it anymore. My face is in the mud, and I gotta say, you win, and take my hand out. So they're really amazing animals, and we're gonna learn a lot about it today. I'm gonna talk about some of the organizations that we work with to manage these incredible animals. Of course, I'm with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. We do almost all the hunting and fishing. But this animal is so unique that the Washington legislature said, that's not an animal to us, that is a valuable material, like timber and gold and other things. So we're going to set geoducks aside from all the other fisheries in Washington and say, you are going to directly benefit the state's bottom line. It funds a lot of education, a lot of conservation projects. So we're going to auction off the rights to harvest geoduck, just like we do with timber. And that money's going to go directly into state coffers, those prices. Normally that's not how a fishery works, right? You get money for buying a license to fish, or there's a tax on landings, but the actual price is all going to the fishermen. In this case, a huge amount of money is going back to the state. So that's why we partner with the Washington Department of Natural Resources, who does that sort of thing. We're not really in the business in Fish and Wildlife of auctioning off tracts, but they know how to do it. So we work very closely with them, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Of course, we got to get the Department of Health involved to make sure they're safe to eat, safe to export, and then we co-manage the resource. We don't manage it with the Northwest Treaty Tribes, particularly the 15 tribes that have rights to fish in the Puget Sound. And so they're sovereign nations, so our negotiations with them are a little bit more like an international negotiation. And I didn't receive any training for that part of my job whatsoever. I'm just a scientist. I should have done like Model UN if I had known when I was a kid. So they have their own biologists, they do their own stock assessments, and we come together and try to figure out what is the best way to have sustainable fishery. So a lot of the data you're seeing is also, half of it's been guided by the tribes as well. Let's talk a little bit about the life cycle. You start out, like a lot of marine invertebrates, free spawning. So eggs and sperm are just going directly out into the water, and they have to meet outside the body. Those embryos are going to develop for a couple of days before they turn into this really cool larval phase called the villager. Looks like a mini clam with a transparent shell. And if I had a video, which I don't unfortunately, they have a little helicopter blade that comes out the top called a velum, and that could actually let them swim around in the currents. And they're going to go for a month or two, drifting around in the currents before settling down and finding a good patch of hopefully sand, their favorite substrate to settle into. And you've got a burrowing juvenile right there. You can see that little foot, like any sort of clam, that's going to help it dig down. Yes, question.
How do they know it's mating time?
Good question. A lot of ways. They'll synchronize sometimes with the phases of the moon that they can feel the tides and all spawn together. Or when one goes, the others are like, oh, it's spawning time. They can sense the chemicals in the water. Everybody's right at that. They usually go. That's, a lot of times it's May or June around here.
Get it together.
It's a good question. I bring up this little digging foot like you've seen clams dig because they do dig down and get into the sediment. But once they become an adult and they're 2 or 3 feet down, that foot actually becomes what we call vestigial. It doesn't develop anymore, so it stays about this size, which is not enough to dig for a clam that's this size, right? And you can see it in there if you dissect a geoduck. There's just a little weird foot sticking out. They cannot rebury themselves, like almost all clams. If you've gone razor clamming and you put it on the beach in 30 seconds, it can be back under the sand and be away from you. Geoduck, not the case. Their protection is how deep they go. And since not many things can get them down there, they can pull their necks all the way back down. They don't need to dig anymore. But it does mean if you do dig one up, and the regulations are such that you can't say, I don't like this geoduck and put it back, because it's probably not going to survive. So they dig deep and stay there, as it turns out, for decades. Why do we care so much about this particular clam? They're delicious, I think. If you've ever, has anyone eaten geoduck here? That's pretty good.
Vegetarian.
And particularly in countries in Asia, will pay hundreds of dollars a pound for a whole geoduck. So that's why it's so valuable. Yes.
I have to ask why GEO is gooey.
That was just a mistake from 100 years ago. Trying to translate from a Native American term, which meant to dig, Geoduck, and someone tried to spell it weirdly, and it stuck. Or you could say it's competition with the quahog from New England, which is actually pronounced quahog.
Can't you just use the indigenous name?
So each coast has to have a weirdly pronounced or spelled clan, I think. So that's why they're so valuable, is people will pay a lot for them. I do want to just make a quick distinction that my job has to do with, on the left, fishery on wild animals. Obviously, Washington and other places have a very large industry doing aquaculture, mostly in the tides. And you can see them here, stamping PVC tubes into the ground. They're going to plant geoduck seed in there, pull a net over the top, although Bruce was just telling me they've got some better ways to do it nowadays, but this was the old way to do it. And then protect the geoducks and let them grow on the beach and harvest them out. That is not really going to be the subject of the talk. I know a little bit about it, but we're talking mainly about the wild fishery today. Both are happening in Washington. So, I don't know if anybody knows anything about fishery management, but you know, the geoduck fishery, as I said, is really nothing like a standard fishery where you've got these quotas and you say fishermen go out and take this many fish from these places. Like I said, it's a lot more like forestry than a fishery management, which again, I didn't get any training in forestry, so maybe I should have done some different schooling. Like I said, DNR is auctioning off specific tracts though, and saying you're going to take your geoduck from these, 50 or 100 acres, like we would a forest. Geoducks live about as long as trees do. We have on my team, Bethany is probably the world expert on Asian geoducks by cutting thin sections of their shell and counting their rings, just like a tree. The oldest one, I think on record, is 176 years old. So that's like Civil War time born, and still hanging out until dug by our scientists, unfortunately. But the average age is still slightly older than I am. The average age is 49 years old in this town. So they're living a very long time. And so the process for thinking about harvesting a tract and having it come back is a lot like the process, I think, for forestry. In that it's going to be decades before we're going to go back to a particular place again. Which makes managing the fishery really interesting because I am judging decisions that were made 20 to 30 years ago, and then whoever comes after me is going to see how I did. And maybe they can come back here and tell you all and a hard love spent in the 2050s. I do want to mention about that auction, one of the things that it funds, other than my salary, is the Aquatic Lands Enhancement Account, or ALEA. If you've heard of that, you might see a plaque at Coastal Park that says ALEA funds used to make this. I just pulled out some of the grants for this current, biennium. What is being funded by ALEA funds from the geoduck fishery? Let's see, we got Vashon, Tramp Harbor Dock, you may have heard of that. I don't know if there's anything. Spot whatever you think about the impacts of the fishery, it does have some positive benefits on the back end. Oh yeah, Port Orchard waterfront. All sorts of stuff around here in this 2 years.
Lake Bay,
Narrows
Fox
Park.
Island, Lake.
Cool. So what do I do when I get up in the morning? I think about 3 things. Accurate stock assessment. I need to know how many geoducks there are. I want to know how many geoducks we should be taking every year, the sustainable harvest rate, and I would like to take those geoducks without impacting other species as much as possible. So we'll talk a little bit about those 3 things. Accurate stock assessment. I put this picture up because it was taken, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s. You can tell by the dive gear, maybe the quality of the photograph, but we do it the exact same way still because it's not broken. Those are 2 divers. They've got a spool of line between them. You can put one end of the line with a stake in the ground, and then we're rolling out that spool as we swim together for 150 feet and putting it so old that we use feet still, and putting a bar that's 6 feet 6 feet wide in between us, and counting all the geoducks under that bar. And we strip transects all over a geoduck track to try to figure out how many there are. Sounds pretty simple, and it is, especially when a geoduck looks like it does on the left there. Obviously a geoduck, easy to see, it's sticking up there. Unfortunately, that's seldom how they look actually underwater. On the right is even generous. You can see a little bit of that flesh and a little bit of the opening. Sometimes it's just that oval circle, which you gotta kind of touch and make sure there's a geoduck under there. And not one of the many other things it could be. The other large bivalves. This is a horse clam down here. Not nearly as valuable, but can look a lot like a geoduck. That there, the second one is even more vexing. It's called a false geoduck, but it's really short and not marketable. The piddock and the cockle there aren't quite as confusing, but you know, it gets really dark and murky down there if you've done any diving or snorkeling. So it can be kind of hard to actually do the counting, and sometimes you're doing it a little bit more by touch than let's say. We got to dig some of them, of course, to get the average weights and the quality and other metrics, and get those shells so we can age them, thin section them, and age them. So here's a dig sample, and let's watch a video of taking that sample. How about? This is off our older boat, the Clandestine. Here's Bob. Bob's since retired, but we don't have a new video. Bethany's going to go on with a GoPro in her hand. She's got a bag there to put the geoducks into. Bob's got a fire hose there with a wand, and he's going to use that same way that commercial divers will do it, although they're usually on surface supply air and not scuba. Right here we're off benching a spit, I believe. We're checking out everything, making sure everybody's good, and now they're going to look for geoducks. He's going to make a little movement and grab that siphon, and then he's going to let the siphon pull him down while it retracts. And he's going to use the wand to sort of liquefy the mud around it so that he can pull the whole geoduck up. Which if you dug a geoduck on the beach, it takes like an hour, and he did that in, I don't know, 30 seconds or something. So I don't think I'll ever dig one on the beach again. And then through this, you can also see some of the possible impacts to the fishery. You can see some sediment coming up there that wouldn't be there otherwise. Occasionally, some other invertebrates or clams will be displaced, kicked out with that water jet. People do think that it's sort of vacuuming, and it's not. It's the opposite. It's injecting water in. He's got another one, I think. He's quite pretty good. Ducks.
So is that water just stun the geoducks?
No, it's just loosening up the settlement around them. And actually, it's powerful enough that it could damage the flesh. You want to keep it actually away from the clam itself. Just work it around, while your hands around, kind of work it around and get it so that it's loose enough to pull out without ripping the siphon. So there's a dig hole. We've done some studies, that will be gone in a day or two with the movement of the currents. Well, at least you won't be able to tell where it was. What are you talking about now? Oh, she's found another one there. Geoducks are pretty sparse here for this dig sample. So Two more. Okay. Good job. And that's the last one. Now they're gonna go right back up. Oh no, first they're gonna load the bag. Sometimes there'd be more. There's only probably about 25 in here, but you know, especially if it was even heavier, give me a signal to the boat to pull it up. And then they're gonna go back up the fire hose to the boat after a safety stop. So the current's picking up a little bit now, to hang on to the fire hose. Back up the ladder. See the big bump there, the compressor's pulling water up the other side of the boat into the fire hose. Okay, look at that handsome guy running the pump. So that's pretty similar to how geoducks are dug commercially, and that's how we did it for our samples too. Put accurate stock assessment in quotes because there's a major problem with county geoducks, and let me know if you can help me out with ideas here, that I think does really make it different than trees. Trees can't pull, Douglas fir cannot pull all the way down into the ground. Completely unsure if there's a Douglas fir or not, and then come back up later when you walk through. Geoducks, of course, can do that. So we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out what we call the show factor. How many of them are showing? And by showing, even you can't see, but that you can see a little divot in the tags. Because sometimes they're so far down that there's nowhere you can go. So on the left, a diver is got some plots marked off the line. You can see some sea whips there that we didn't put there. And then here are little nails with some flagging tape next to all the geoducks we can find. There's a variety of ways we can try to census this whole plot over a period of time, or using disturbance to make them. And then we've got an area where we think we know how many there are, and it's a place we can go back to and count on any given day and see what the geoducks on this plot are doing. We're also starting to work with time-lapse cameras. You can see one there in the stand on the right, and watching the siphons go up and down. These time-lapse cameras, I will mention, are getting they were quite the purchase, because we use them for this. We use them to watch our abalone. Right now, they're watching the state's first release of sunflower sea stars by University of Washington. And so we loan them to them. And then they've even been loaned to Harbor Wild Watch. What do you guys watch? Baby rockfish?
We were looking for baby rockfish.
Yeah.
Daytime, nighttime.
So we figure if you don't just sit on a shelf when we're not using them. So these guys, I feel like they're in the water more than they're not. They're getting to be popular. Another thing I mentioned was reducing the impacts to other species. So one of the biggest ones we think about is the marine vegetation, and particularly eelgrass beds. So wild geoduck tracks only start at the minimum. They can start at 18 feet deep, so expressly for the purpose of staying out of the eelgrass. But we still want to do a survey, so we run the entire shallow boundary of a track, which can be miles, but we get to use these cool scooters, looking for deeper beds of eelgrass. And if we find them, we're pushing the geoduck tracks offshore. Eelgrass, as you probably know, as a nursery habitat. I've got a picture here filled with herring eggs, nursery habitat for crab, a lot of things that eelgrass does for us. So we definitely don't want geoduck harvest in eelgrass beds whatsoever. So that's a big thing, big part of it. And then lastly, how many should we take? Here is this one of Bethany's cool hinge plates, thin sectioned and dyed, and you can see those annual growth rings. This one seems to be about as old as I am. And that's what we're using, or what they used 20, 30 years ago to figure out how many we should take. If you age a bunch of geoducks, you may think, oh, you just know how old they are, but there's a lot you can do with that information about learning about the turnover in the population, about who's living and dying and when they're being born, and use that to set your harvest rate. Other cool stuff you can do with it is think about, when were geoducks born? So this is a plot of 4 big pig samples. We took, one of them you saw being dug at Dungeness Spit there in purple, but Richmond Beach is the Golden Gardens area of Seattle, you know where that is. Taylor Bay is south of us here off the Key Peninsula in South Puget Sound. Dungeness Spit, and then Alden Bank is a big pile of sand north of the San Juan Islands, kind of halfway between the San Juans. Canada that has a bunch of geoducks. And you look along the x-axis there, and we've got counting back from when the sample was taken in about 2013, 2014, going back to 1950, and reconstructing when all those geoducks were born. It's a little bit weird because I've got relative recruitment, so I can't really compare the magnitude of each site. So each site's best years are 1 and each site's worst years is 0. But still, you can look at the timing, and you can see that none of the sites are really lining up whatsoever. But there's huge fluctuations year to year in how many geoducks are being successfully born and surviving to when we can pick them decades later. So it's a really complex system, and there's not, you can look at X, Y, and Z makes a good geoduck here because it really depends on where you are and a lot of different factors. So this has been a mystery we're still looking at. And we're also moving away from using this method to determine how many geoducks we should take each year using their ages. Yes?
Do you have any way that you're able to see geoducks dying in a given year?
Yes. We have done, so doing the ages is one way where you can kind of see what the natural mortality rate is by looking at everybody's age. But there's a direct way to do it, and we have done that as well. And that's much like that show plot where we were putting those stakes in the ground next to the geoducks. We've gone out to 3 places and put 1,000 stakes in the ground next to 1,000 geoducks, and then waited an entire year and gone back and seen how many are still alive. And if there's a stake there and we can't find the geoduck, actually using a dredge to suction down and confirm that there's a dead geoduck there or nothing at all. So that's another way to look at. We haven't seen it, but that's another way to look at the same answer. Lately, now, my predecessors 20, 30 years ago didn't have that much information about how fast the tracks were regenerating because this thing takes so long. But now, we've been fishing these geoducks for about 50 years, and so I get the benefit of knowing how fast geoducks are coming back. Here's the South Puget Sound, a little figure, and the bigger, bluer circles are tracks that come back really fast. As they get smaller and lighter, or even get to a red triangle where it's negative, so it's basically no recovery, the error in the survey makes it seem like negative. You can kind of see some spatial patterns about where geoduck harvest is sort of sustainable on a rotational basis. You can see in the central basin right here. There's a lot of them, and where maybe it's a little bit more like mining, like those geoduck tracks aren't going to come back in my lifetime, and that's not, we can't depend on them to come back and harvest other places as if those places are going to come back. So back when they were, right now, I think a track comes back on average every about 55 years to come back, which is similar to forestry, but that's 40% slower than they thought in, say, 1999, 2000 when they were last doing this. They thought it was about 40 years. Based on the information they had, I'm not throwing shade, they were doing a great job, but based on the information. So now I think it is with a lot more tracks and a lot more time. Maybe it's slowed over time, or maybe we just have more information. I think it's more like 55, which means we need to dial down the wild harvest. And surprisingly not that much. We're going from 2.7% of the geoducks that we know about each year to like 2% might be about right. So we're just slowly throttling back, and I'll show you an example of that from where you are. This Gig Harbor area is in what we call South Sound Region A. It's also the Puyallup exclusive, so we're sharing it just with the Puyallup tribe and no other tribes. And I don't have the outlines of the tracks here, but I just put a dot in the center of basically all the geoduck tracks in this subregion. And colors for which ones, the blue ones have basically been harvested at some point in the last 50 years and are hopefully coming back. Orange ones is where we are right now, those two. And then green ones, a lot of the ones down here have not ever been harvested. So that all adds up to a commercial biomass of about 23 million pounds of geoduck if you add all those tracks together. And I underline commercial because that's not how many geoduck there are, that's how many that are in between 18 feet and 70 feet in areas that are approved by Department of Health. So they're actually, that's very a small subset of geoducks because they can live down to 300 feet and of course, they can go shallower as well. So the commercial, the biomass that we're sort of planned to harvest safely in approved areas is 23 million pounds. Right now, like I said, we started at 2.7 everywhere for the last for decades, but we're starting to dial that back right now. We're at 2.3. So every year out of your area, a little over 500,000 pounds of geoduck is taken, half by the Gulf tribe and half by us. And I think if we get down to closer to 2% over the next few years, I think by my calculations, that'll be a rate at which those tracks in blue will be back. Plenty of them will be back and ready to be harvested by the time you're done with tracks in green and orange. That's the idea.
What's the optimal age for harvesting and taste of geoducks?
That's a good question. Most geoducks aren't aged, and a lot of geoducks we age aren't tasted. So, some of them are. They're in my freezer. I would say the market, and this is kind of a different topic, but it's an important one. The market, particularly in Asia, is about aesthetics. They're not just eating it. I think the meat probably tastes the same throughout. But what they look like can really differ. And they can have the smooth white skins. I hate to be racist with my clams, but that's apparently what the market wants. Whereas there can also be really wrinkled and dark and really look unappetizing until you peel all that off and get to the meat, and then it probably looks the same. So I don't think that's necessarily age. That could be the conditions that they live under, the sediments, the cobble, all sorts of things. But unfortunately, how they look is really important. So that means that harvesters are under pressure to bring the best looking geoducks back to their buyers for a bid. But you can't tell really what they look like, especially if I told you you can't even really see the flesh, you're just seeing a little divot. And you can't put the ugly ones back because they're going to die. So you got to take them all. And that's, I think, one of the problems is the harvesters are under pressure to try to only bring back the good ones. And DNR has a whole compliance dive team. That's the boats are on site for all harvests, so do the tribes and the tribal police. And they're even doing compliance dives where they're checking the boats to see if they're stashing the ugly ducks, or shoving them back down into the dig holes or anything like that. Because it's a really valuable fishery. 2 pounds, they're getting, depending, well, when there's tariffs they're not, but they're normally getting upwards of $10 a pound. So it's in 30 seconds you're pulling up a $20 bill if it's a good looking geoduck. So that's why the auctions, and that's why so much compliance and enforcement stuff. Speaking of which, let's look at one of the tracks. The track that's one of those blue dots along the east side of Vashon Island, called creatively Vashon East. These are a series of surveys over the years of the same tract. So we do surveys before harvest, sometimes during, but then normally after, and then a series of surveys to see how it's recovering. So at first, and we got the density of geoducks per square foot. So really good high density there. To start in the 80s, and then pretty quickly in a few years of harvest, they've taken it down by 1985 to its post-harvest density. So that's sort of before and after harvest for the first 2 dots. And then, they come back in 10 years and see a really nice recovery trajectory there. So things are on pace for, maybe harvest by now, maybe by 2025 we could be back on Vashon East, harvesting it again. Looks good, except for this one. What happened there? And there's a book about what happened there, and it's a really good read. It's called Shell Games. It's by a Seattle Times reporter, and it's about wildlife smuggling and poaching. And they talk about a lot of different species, but the whole story is kind of framed around geoducks and how the lengths that people will go to try to poach them and export them, to smuggle them through Las Vegas apparently. There were mafia involved and people blowing up each other's boats. It's really exciting. It's a good read. I recommend it. Luckily, after that setback, we're back on track somewhat. But you can see that it's part of the problem maybe why tracks aren't recovering as fast as I thought they should be, or they thought they should be. This illegal harvest is an issue. Hopefully mostly a past issue. But if it's a present issue and you see any signs, there should never be a geoduck generator or harvest boat operating at night. You can see this picture statement in the dark. You can actually use 911 if you want. If you think there's a dive boat offshore and they seem to be pumping water and doing something, and you can just tell them, I want to report a poaching in progress, and they'll shunt you to the right place and to the hospital or the fire department. There's a lot of ways to report anonymously. Gig Harbor gets a lot of offloads of geoducks during the day of legal harvest from Puyallup Tribe events. But there's, as I showed you that map, a lot of the tracks around you are going to be up for harvest in the coming decades. I think that's going to continue to be true. And if you see something that seems weird, you can call me or email me. Or if it's in progress, better to go straight to the enforcement because I can't do anything about it. And I might be scuba diving myself and not get your call. But we have great enforcement officers, but we only have so many. So we really rely on folks like you keeping an eye out. Something seems strange. I get a lot of calls, people saying there's a geoduck harvest in front of my house, and usually it's that's Puyallup Tribe, and that's perfectly legal, and thank you. And I still really appreciate those calls because it means people are out there just looking around. And maybe I'll stop there, see if there's more questions.
What's the relationship between adjacent species of just anything besides the geoduck recovery?
It's a great question. We have found in our studies, both on the beach, other people's studies on the beach, and our studies, that community comes back within a year or two, very similar, minus the geoducks, of course, very similar species composition and abundance.
So you're counting the worms and all of that stuff that lives under the soil?
We're not usually counting the worms, to be honest. We're noting the presence of them on each of the transects. So we don't have the qualitative data on everything. We have some stuff like crab and things that people care about now, more sea stars and things. But we are, definitely. So we have every track is getting this pre-harvest survey, so we know what was there before anybody touched it, and then it's getting a post-harvest, and usually down the line some other things. So we have a pretty good idea of what the community's doing. We've done directed studies to make sure it doesn't seem to do anything to Dutch-nose crab, and it doesn't. I think it's because the community, a lot of this community is a shifting sand community. It's a dynamic community. So I'm not saying there aren't impacts of harvest, there definitely are, but I think as a whole, it's a resilient community to that kind of disturbance, and then it's coming back the way it was, within a year or two. Now, if we got into kelp beds, geograph beds, I think that would be a different story.
Is geoduck health very sensitive to water quality?
Yes and no. They're pretty resilient, obviously, living for as long as they have. And there's some things like, there's a lot of geoduck on southern Vashon where the Alcoa smelter was dumping heavy metals for a long time. They're able to withstand some of that. Sewage, there'll be geoducks around sewage outfalls, not to preempt some questions. But the main issue would be then for the humans that are going to eat those geoducks. Where they're not resilient is dissolved oxygen. The Southern Hood Canal used to have a lot of geoduck tracks, and it doesn't have hardly any geoduck as far as we know because of dissolved oxygen problems in the Southern Hood Canal. They can't. There's only so long. I mean, they're pretty resilient, but they can't go anywhere. So, and the on the bottom is where the oxygen is lowest. If you've ever seen one of those events, you'll see it's bizarre. I haven't, but it's bizarre. You'll see rockfish and shrimp, from the surface of your boat because they're all getting up to where the oxygen is. But obviously, geoduck can't do that. Temperature, I think I don't know about intertidally, but I think they're pretty resilient because there's just the temperature does not vary that much, and they're down in the sediment, so they're extra buffered to temperature. So ocean acidification, I would really worry about for their larval stages and temperature on their larval stages, but as adults, they're probably pretty resilient.
What's their dispersion, say, up and down the west coast, up through Canada? Where will you start to see them, and when do they start to taper off?
Yeah, they go up through southeast Alaska, but not farther into Alaska than southeast. And then to the south, this species is right around the California. There's some in like the sandbanks of the Channel Islands. There's this geoduck. But there's another species that's down in the Sea of Cortez, and the Mexicans have a fishery on that geoduck species. And there's other ones in New Zealand, Australia, other geoduck species. None are as good as ours, I'm sure.
Do California and Oregon have similar kind of laws in the way they regulate geoducks?
They don't really have a fishery because their populations are pretty isolated and scattered. The Puget Sound is really unique in that way, and behind Vancouver Island and some spots in Southeast Alaska, the inlets are more where their big populations are.
Rachel, will you ask your mobile pump-out question?
I thought you were going to ask it, so let me think about the words. We partner with Pierce County to promote and kind of get the word out about their mobile pump out services for boaters. Is there a threat to geoducks from boaters that you would be aware of?
Yeah. Like I said in the past question, the actual when people are dumping their sewage into the sound, there's a lot of reasons not to do that. The geoduck themselves are probably going to be okay, but there's water sampling that goes into making the geoduck safe to eat and safe to export. And so when those fail, then the geoduck tracks close down and the whole thing falls apart. So it's more about human health for that, for a lot of things. But anchoring is a threat. Can mess with geoducks as those anchors dig in. Other than that, I can't think of too many boaters.
Great, thank you.
But motor pump, that's a great idea.
Predators, geoducks, what are they?
Yeah, good question. So there's a ton of predators, as larvae and juveniles, crabs, fish, sea stars, everything's eating them, and it's a race for them to get deep enough to where there aren't nearly as many predators anymore, other than humans. That said, I've been showing video in Alaska of a sea otter digging geoducks.
Really?
And it takes it several trips back and forth to the surface because it doesn't have if you see people on the beach, they'll put a garbage can without a bottom to make sure the sides don't cave in while they're digging deeper and deeper. Sea otters have not invented that yet. I think they're smart, but they're not that smart.
Give them time.
So yeah, they have to take a very wide pit to get down to the geoduck. It takes them a lot of dives, but pretty nutritious when they get there. I've heard some geoduck farmers concerned about sea lions and seals nipping damage to the siphons. So things can, if they're quick enough, get that siphon and maybe rip a piece off. And whether or not the geoduck lives, it's hard to say. But I've definitely seen living geoducks with damaged siphons too. So there's some things that can still get at them. They don't pull it out quick enough.
So oysters and clams have all kinds of nasty things. People eat them. Viruses and bacteria. Do geoducks have the same issue, same type of problem?
They have the same big problem with paralytic shellfish poisoning. There's a lot of testing. There's weekly testing for that on every track that's open to make sure that we're not sending paralytic shellfish poisoning products overseas. But other than that, I have not heard of any cases of Vibrio or some of the other things. I don't know why that is, but it may just have to do with the way they live and they're prepared. They're not holding water in a shell like oysters.
But if they live so long, heavy metals, do they stick around in the tissue?
Yeah, there's some problems with arsenic. So there's also arsenic testing of some tissues in particular.
If a sample of geoduck is found to have, say, arsenic in it, how much sampling continues on at that point to find out the propensity of
when it gets to a certain level, it's not approved for export anymore, and then it's just not attractive anymore.
So do you just leave them alone, and maybe he'll dispense out from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do go back and try some other samples at some point, but yeah, they definitely wait to see. 'Cause yeah, that stuff, the metal, the PSP can move through, you sample again, and then it's gone, and you can continue, but the heavy metals is definitely different.
What percent of geoducks stay in the domestic market versus going overseas?
Don't know that, but it's very small.
That stays domestic.
At least from the wild fishery. But I think for the farms as well, it's probably also quite small. There's got a few storefronts and you can buy geoduck there, but I think that's less than 1%, I guess. Most of it's going directly to SeaTac.
So how did you personally get so deeply involved with geoducks?
That's a good question. I did finished a doctorate in marine ecology, actually working on Olympia oysters and their population connectivity, and just got involved in other shellfish studies, and also enjoyed scuba diving and had some dive experience. So I got actually the first job I was hired on was to be the sea cucumber and sea urchin fishery manager. So I started there, and then later became the team lead. Yeah, once you start working with the dive fisheries, that's the biggest dive fishery around. And there's a lot of, we call our team thread is called Geoduck Mysteries, because there's just a lot we don't know. They're pretty amazing creatures, and there's a lot of mysteries to be involved, to be unraveled. So it keeps me engaged.
Not a direct follow-up, but how are geoducks different from clams? What distinguishes them?
Not really anything. They're just a really big clam with no foot and a really long neck.
Why such a small percentage retained for domestic? There's just not a place for it?
I don't know exactly, but I assume, it's basically the amount that American consumers willing to pay. Quite a bit if you've had it in a restaurant, but not nearly as much as someone in China would pay. I think I'm told it's like a celebratory or an important business function. If you want to impress your clients, you'll have a whole geoduck on the table, and you'll pay a lot more for that.
I've heard outrageous stories of how they get FedEx shipped in ice on a plane, or maybe even a seat on an airplane to be taken over to Singapore or Japan, because they want to see the whole geoduck as part of the presentation, not just to cut up into pieces. And that's impressive because it's the largest burrow plant in the world.
Yeah, you'll see the picture I had here. In those crates, they've got a rubber band around each one, because as they start to get, they'll last quite a long time live, but as they start to get weak, they'll kind of flop open. Their adductor muscles, the big muscle in all clams and oysters and mussels that's holding that shell closed, and it's really strong, but as they get weak, they'll start to come open, and that's not a pleasing sight. So they keep those rubber bands on it. Yeah, almost every, you can see it down here, right? Right by the Tides Tavern, one of those docks, the right afternoon. You'll see crates like that coming off a boat, and they're going into a refrigerated truck, and that truck's going straight to SeaTac. And they're getting, it's just a standard flight, but whatever flight's going to Asia, they're buying space on that, and it's going direct. It's there, tomorrow.
I think the U.S. market gets the ugly geoducks, they're all chopped up and in chowder.
Yeah.
And then the nice looking ones are probably 100 times more than we do on the way.
And same with a lot of, I think, the sea urchin and the sea cucumber. We're not going to pay a lot for a sea cucumber around here, but people will.
It's considered an aphrodisiac.
Oh my God!
They
Even
say a
Ron
lot of things. We just had a big fuss if you started using bear gallbladders.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, give him flu
But
pills.
Why?
So, what would make your job easier? It's like, as you do your job, what would make it easier? It's like, what is the big problem that you need a solution to?
I mean, I did bring up the idea, figuring out what makes a geoduck decide to pull its siphon up and down. We know a lot about it. There's a big seasonal cycle. We actually don't do any surveys in the winter for this species because they're less likely. This probably has to do with the phytoplankton that they're eating in the water, which is, so it's a big seasonal cycle that we know about. But on a given day, sometimes, we have got these plots where we know how many ducks there are. And sometimes it'll be about the same every day for 2 weeks, and then it'll just drop, and they've all just decided. And then you go survey the tract, and sure enough, you found patches where it don't appear to be any geoducks. And so, but it's not that simple either. So it's getting more model together where we can use our time-lapse footage and the water chemistry and what the tidal currents. We've got a current meter now we're putting next to the time-lapse camera to see the tides exchange and try to crack that. I think would make us way more accurate because our error bars on how many geoducks we think there are pretty wide, and that has big implications as you're planning a multi-year harvest. If there's a lot, obviously, we try to be very conservative, and normally it works out, and that there turned out to be more there than we estimated, but still, it'd be really nice to know a better number.
Okay, I'm gonna ask our last question for the night, and then assume you could stick around if people have more burning wonders.
Yes, I can.
But what is your strangest, geoduck factoid or little nugget that you're just like, why is this animal so cool to you?
Good question. What do you think? I mean, just back calculating the age of any particular geoduck and being like, what did you think of the Eisenhower administration? I've heard mixed reviews. It's just really mind-blowing, I guess, to me. It's not a weird, quirky fact, but it's just mind-blowing to me, again, that I'm doing the best I can with the information I have, and I really do. And I'm saying, hey, people 30 years ago, you did a great job, but it's a little bit too high, a little bit too fast. Let's turn down the harvest. I'm fascinated to know in 30 years how, hopefully I'm still alive and can check in and figure out how I did and what some of these answers were. It's a mind-blowing pace. Usually you get, in 5 years, you can be like, oh, we screwed up, or oh, it went great. In some of those fisheries we have, we've made adjustments, and then 5-10 years later, you can see the results. In this one, we'll see.
Wow.
That's good.